It's Black History Month in the UK, Ireland and the Netherlands, marked by lessons in schools and events nationwide. It brings into focus how the subject should be discussed and taught. But is it time for a rethink of how we teach Black history in Europe? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady now with race riots in the UK and the far right rising across Europe. Now more than ever could be the time to know more about Black history on the continent. Black History Month works to offer this lens into history, but is it enough? And why aren't more European countries actually embracing it?
Black History Month was created to counter the lack of comprehensive Black history taught in schools. As Ejeko Nwabazode said, the reason why Black History Month was initiated was because of the institutional racism within the schools and within the curriculum, and the fact that either Black people's histories were omitted or there was discriminatory racist stereotyping of Black people. While the United States has addressed this issue, Europe is lagging behind in recognising the histories of Black people in the continent. According to the Black Curriculum Research Group, only 11% of UK secondary school students learn about Black history outside of the Atlantic slave trade, and only 10% of the schools in the UK teach Black history at all. Yet, Black people have been in Britain since at least the Roman Empire. In the UK and EU states like the Netherlands and Germany, the curriculum is too US-centric and about narratives of struggle, namely the Atlantic slave trade. Black History Month highlights more positive narratives to change public understanding of the race. Black Tudors of the 16th century, such as John Blank, who was a royal trumpeter in the courts of King Henry VIII. Born in the 18th century, John Edmonston was a teacher of Charles Darwin. And in the 19th century, Aya Aldrich was one of the highest paid actors in the world at the time. Lillian Badder was the first Black woman to join the British Armed Forces in 1941. Between 1948 and 73, the Windrush generation of people from the Caribbean took up jobs in sectors like the health service to fill Britain's post-war shortage. Black and ethnic minorities today still make up almost a quarter of all UK health staff. To Bishop Wilfred Wood, the Church of England's first Black bishop in 1985, to Margaret Busby, Britain's first Black female publisher, to Dr. Naira Chamberlain, one of the UK's top scientists, to Diane Abbott, the first Black woman to be elected into Parliament. So is it time to revamp the teaching of Black history in Europe?
Well, let's meet our guests. In Canterbury in England, we have Professor Hakim Adi. He's an award-winning historian and the first historian of African heritage to become a professor of African history in Britain. He's also an author. His latest publication is Africa and Caribbean People in Britain, A History. In London, we have Shola Mos-Shogbamimu. She's a lawyer, a women's rights activist, and the author of This Is Why I Resist, Don't Define My Black Identity. And I'm delighted to say here in the studio with me is the journalist and broadcaster Afua Hagan. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. I want to come to you first, Shola. Morgan Freeman, no less, has said that he does not like Black History Month. He regards it as an insult. And to quote the man himself, he says, "You're relegating my history to a month." Has he got a point?
Hi, I think he does have a point because Black history isn't a 1 month incident. It's every day. Black history is British history. Black history is American history, and but the reason we all know why a month was dedicated or is being dedicated to Black history, and there was a lot of work done to even have this month. This is to ensure that that Black people in both countries are celebrated, recognized. It's also to ensure that the history and contributions of Black people to this country are actually recognized in a way that is significant and in a way that speaks to the truth of who we are, rather than the whitewashed history given to us by our white, counterparts in these countries. So, I mean, right now, I see his point, but right now it is a necessity. What I don't like is that we have a Black History Month that seems to be relegated to and is subjected to the DEI, and it's also subjected to the whims of those who are in power. They seem to determine what we can talk about, what it is we can celebrate, what it is that we can share. And worst of all is that Black history seems to be just about October, if it's the UK, or February, if it's in the US. And it doesn't flow into November, December, or every other month of the year. So it's clear that nothing is changing, and no one is learning what they should learn. And when I say no one, I mean the very people that should be learning about it are not putting it into practice.
Hakim, just come in on that. Do you think Morgan Freeman is right that it should be every week, every month, year round, and not just 1 month?
Well, of course it should be. I mean, history is history. History cannot be for 1 month of the year. I guess the only advantage that we have in Britain is that the longest month has been chosen, whereas in the US they've chosen the shortest month, which is even more of an insult. But Black History Month is the recognition that for the rest of the year, this history is largely ignored. It's the recognition that essentially there's a problem, that this history is marginalized, and therefore the history of this country, if we want to look at it just in British terms, the history of this country is distorted, and we're less able to understand the country in which we live and its history than we otherwise would be. And I think that this is the problem. The other thing at the moment is that although we may have a month, history, the way that history is being taught or presented in universities is under attack. The courses which I taught were closed down, and I was made redundant last year. Similar courses at Goldsmiths have also been under attack, and those who teach them under threat of redundancy. And similarly in other universities, let alone talking about what goes on or doesn't go on in schools. So all the time there is the marginalization of this history, and having just 1 month to recognize that marginalization, if you like, certainly doesn't solve the problem.
Hakim,
I think the other thing that's
who's driving that marginalization?
Well, we live in a society which is, Eurocentric almost by definition. We're the products of, unfortunately, the history of this country, which in a great part was the history of empire, the history of human trafficking, enslavement, and so on. And we have the ideas, the values of the white men of property who presided over those criminal acts in the past. They are the ones who, we could say, dominate this country, are the powers that be, and determine largely what goes on in schools, what goes on in universities, what goes on in the media, and so on. So we're constantly having to struggle against that weight of history, if you like, the Eurocentrism that exists in the society, in which it has created a situation where people who grew up in this country cannot be permitted to fully understand the history of the country in which they live. I mean, that's a ridiculous situation. Let me just give you one example of something which is referred to as Black history, which is the abolitionist movement in the 18th century, perhaps the biggest political movement in Britain's history ever, but nobody ever talks about it because it's marginalized as something which only belongs to Africans or belongs to workers or belongs to women. But actually, it's the history of the whole country. It's probably one of the highest spots of Britain's history, but it's marginalized. Nobody talks about it. And so we're presented with a completely distorted history of this country. And this distortion, this very one-sided view of Britain's history has to be brought to an end.
Thanks, Hakim. Shola, I'll come back to you in a moment. I know you want to come back in. Afua, how sad does it make you feel hearing an eminent historian saying that history is being marginalised, courses are being finished, and effectively whitewashed was a phrase we heard used?
Yeah, I mean, and he's absolutely correct. He's 100% correct. It makes me sad and also makes me angry. And it's not just happening at university level like he so accurately described. It's throughout our schools as well. Let's remember that Black History Month takes place in October, where there is a half term. So actually, schools are only in for probably 3 weeks. They don't get the whole of October to learn about Black History Month. And actually, in my daughter's secondary school, we've worked to implement a Black History season. So it's more than just 1 month. If we go back to what Morgan Freeman said, absolutely, he does have a point that it should be much more than just this 1 month, but it absolutely is being whitewashed. And I think what this also boils down to is people getting their head around Britishness, that Black history is British history. Black people have been in the UK since the 1500s, if not before. And it's trying to impart in the powers that be, those that are so keen to marginalise Black people, that Black people are British, can be British. Therefore, Black history is British history and should be taught every single day of the year.
Shola, just back to you. How does it make you feel hearing what Hakim was saying?
I mean, undoubtedly, it makes me feel quite furious, but I'm not surprised. Everything he said, and he articulated, and just as Afua also said, absolutely spot on. But you asked the question, you said, who is responsible for marginalizing Black history? Who is responsible for shutting down consent around what Black history is and how it should be pushed forward? And the simple answer to that is by starting with what is doing that before we get to who is. What is doing that? It's the ideology of white supremacy. Who is doing that? White people who benefit from white supremacy, and Black and brown people who racial gatekeep. Those are the people who continually tell us that systemic racism is not a thing. These are the people that continually legitimize the dehumanization of Black and brown people in this country. These are the people who say that Black history is not necessary. These are the people that push the ideology of anti-wokeness and totally change everything that being woke was meant to be about, which is to be awakened to racial and social injustice. And from there, to try to address the issues that those things demonstrate. So Black history for the longest time has never really been about Black history. We're still being told by white people, by white-led corporations, you can only talk about this. We will only pay you so much. And actually, this must fit in with our DEI perspective. And even diversity, equity, and inclusion we see is being fought against. So many corporations that went on about hashtag Black Lives Matter 2-3 years down the line since George Floyd, they've all scrapped that, totally scrapped it, which means that it was all performative. So for many Black and brown people, specifically Black people, they feel that any type of talk or allyship that is not backed with substance when it comes to Black history is simply performative. Because I need the audience to understand that Black lives isn't a hotel you can check in and check out of. It isn't, because for us, it's 365 days a year. It is 24/7. So you're either with us or you are not.
Hakim, I want to talk about the curriculum in the schools across the United Kingdom. I see Wales 2 years ago made mandatory changes so that there would be more Black history in the curriculum. Is that something you'd like to see happen maybe in England and Scotland as well?
Everybody should be included in history, and everybody should be included all the year round. So obviously, we want a history curriculum, and not just a history curriculum, a curriculum in general, which reflects the experiences of human beings throughout the world. I mean, Africa is the birthplace of all humanity. So we should be concerned with the history of Africa, for example. So we want a curriculum which enables young people to understand the world in which we live, which is a reflection of the world in which we live, a reflection of the history of the world in which we live. We don't want a distorted view of the world which is coming from the perspective of only of the white men of property, and which is distorting things, which is hiding things, which is creating confusion. I mean, some people remember when Michael Gove was education minister and he wanted to introduce a history curriculum which was essentially only about white men and property. It excluded women, it excluded working people, it excluded black people, it excluded everybody. So this is really where things will, the direction in which things will head, unless we keep struggling to change the situation, as I say, to have something which actually reflects the history of this country. And it was said earlier that black people have been here for since the 15th century. And of course, the first Britons were black. So you could say black people have been here for 10,000 years or so. And throughout Britain's history, there have been black people in this country, but more specifically, people from Africa from the earliest times. So we have to actually, this is not a big deal in the sense that these are just the facts of history. And these are things which should be presented. Why should they be hidden? The problem that we have in the past, we used to talk about the national curriculum and how important it was. Now, with the onset of academies don't necessarily have to follow the national curriculum. So that makes the situation even more difficult. Then we have the problems of the education or miseducation of teachers and of history teachers. Are history teachers provided with the knowledge of the history of this country? Then we have the fact that there are not very many people of African and Caribbean heritage who become history teachers and so on. So there are a whole variety of problems which show that the things that we're reflecting on during this month are things that need to be reflected upon and acted upon throughout the whole year.
Thanks, Hakim. Thank you. I want to bring Afua back in. Afua, how does a black student feel picking up a history book and looking through the pages? You genuinely don't see many black people in history books across the curriculum. I mean, how does that make a student feel?
Well, as a black girl who grew up in Scotland, where, I mean, that is the whitest history you will ever come across, all I learned about, the black history that I learned about was from my parents. So from at home, from research that they did, from things that they imparted in me, whether that was my own personal history from Ghana or whether that was, everything else that surrounded that. And that's why I was so uninterested in history, because it didn't reflect me. It was nothing to do with me. William Wallace, whatever, didn't care. Yes, these things are important. Yes, we should learn about them. But what about everybody else? What about everything else? You feel unseen, you feel excluded. And I'll go back to the point as well, you're made to feel not British. And I think that's a real point. And I think the national curriculum should be, and obviously should be, developed properly so that we can properly reflect our history. By not knowing about all the different kinds of people that were here, the 1800s and 1900s, you're excluding such a massive part of British history. That's disingenuous. That's completely disingenuous to Britain and the United Kingdom. Why would you erase certain parts of history? And because those parts of history are being erased, that's why we are where we are now, that we have so much polarization and division, because people have no clue about the genuine history of the United Kingdom. So people
because it hasn't been taught in the schools.
Absolutely. People are clueless, therefore they make stupid decisions. They have no idea about the genuine history of this country, and that's why we are where we are now.
Shola, talk to me about the role of the British Empire then, because the reason I feel a lot of black history is not taught in schools is because the British Empire still weighs very, very heavily on this country's history, legacy, and education.
I think that the reason for the fact that British history is not told as much as it is, especially when you look at it from the perspective of the British Empire, is because you have many, especially those from the white British, see any attempt to tell the truth about the British Empire as an attempt to make them feel guilty, to make them feel ashamed, and it makes them feel fragile. So, and with all due respect, I would think that, yeah, you should feel ashamed that the British Empire committed so many atrocities across the world in the name of power, and power that did not necessarily trickle down to the working class, power that sat up there and only elevated a few to the detriment of the many. And yes, You should work to change the legacy of that empire. And that legacy of the empire is what we live today. It continually negatively impacts the quality of life and choice of Black and brown people. You have ignorant people that come on places like X, using language, racist language, pushing bigotry, and talking about things about Africa that are totally untrue. They don't recognize the contributions of Africans to mathematics, to science, to a lot of the great things that the British like to claim they did, but it actually happened in Africa first. And you look at the way, to the question you asked Afua earlier about a Black student, looking at history, how would that Black student feel? Let me tell you, I think that it's an indoctrination. So at the age of 10, 11, 12, you know nothing else but what you read in the book. You know nothing else but what you're told. And if the adults around you do not take a conscious step of diversifying and broadening your knowledge from a young age, or if you do not take the conscious decision when you reach a majority to want to know more, that person ends up staying ignorant. That's the point. I'm grateful that part of my education took place in West Africa, and I also lived in East Africa. So if I read a book on history here, I'm like, nah, and I'm older. So with growing up and being more exposed and enlightened, I know what to question, what not to question, but that kind of critical thinking needs to start at a young age for all our children so that they do not, and when I say all our children, I mean white, Black, and brown, and so that they do not make the mistake that our generation and previous generations have made. The British Empire continues to exist through, or the language and the legacy of the British Empire continues to exist through our current political structure. Look at how we have politicians, prime ministers who continue to exude that racist bigotry. And we have Black and brown politicians who are racial gatekeepers, who deny, as I said, systemic racism, who continue to push continue to push the negative effect that we keep talking about, who continue to treat Black history as not necessary. Just a few weeks ago, Keir Starmer said that the Holocaust has to be taught in school, something to that effect. I'm like, why is it that nothing of the sort has been said about Black history, about an entire race of people who have contributed to this country, who have, also gone through holocausts, massacres, genocides of all descriptions? Why is
Shola,
that
I want to bring Hakim back in. The clock is against us. Hakim, Shola just mentioned the British Prime Minister. How long until we see a Black British Prime Minister, do you think?
It will be the same political system where few people make the decisions and the rest of us have no decision-making powers. So if we really want fundamental change, we need to have a situation where it's the many making the decisions, not the few, not just the white men of property and their political system. That's the important thing. That's a system which denies most people a say in how the education system is run, how the health system is run, and all the other things about society. So I think what history shows us is that we are the agents of change, people are the agents of change, and if we want fundamental changes, these are the things that we have to organize for, campaign for. And it's not just the election of a woman or a Black person or whoever it might be that's going to change things, but rather more fundamental changes need to be made. And we all need to have decision-making powers.
Afua, I noticed that the theme this year is reclaiming narratives.
Yeah.
How important is that, do you feel?
I mean, it is important, definitely. Reclaiming narratives, means that we can take charge for once. And I hope that, when people are celebrating Black History Month, because it is a celebration, it's not Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Month, it's not Martin Luther King Month, it's not Make Your Black Employees Do More Work Month, it's not Make Your Black Employees Do the Heavy Lifting Month, it's a celebration month. And so I hope that people do reclaim those narratives. And when I say reclaim those narratives, it's, talking about Black history in a real way. A lot of people, the Black history they get taught at school is slavery. Like, Black history began and ended with slavery. It's way more than that. And actually, slavery is white history. And so I think that reclaiming narratives gives us the opportunity to tell our own stories. And that is so, so important. So yeah, I think it's an important theme for this year. I think it's timely because we are very divided and very polarised at the moment after 14 years of a Conservative government. So I hope during Black History Month, people really take the opportunity to reclaim their narratives, stand in their power and say what they really want to say.
Shola, final question to you. I notice across Europe, it's Black History Month in Ireland, where I'm from, the UK and the Netherlands, and nowhere else. I mean, what does that tell us? Doesn't that tell us everything we need to know here?
Oh, absolutely. And let's be very clear. The fact that we have a Black History Month in the UK, for instance, does not make any difference to the fact that this is a systemically racist country. I mean, people will try to use that as an example of how the UK is the least racist country in Europe. That's utter nonsense. I mean, honestly, the bottom line is across Europe, especially included in the UK, systemic racism is an issue. You look in France, you look everywhere. I mean, here we just a few months ago had race riots based on absolute falsehoods because there are a bunch of people who are determined because of their ignorance, because of their hate and bigotry. They want to take out their own frustration on people that don't look like them, who don't worship the same way they worship, who don't think like them. And this is the problem here across Europe. Racism is white people's problem.
Shola, thank you. Hakim and Afua as well, superb contributions. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.